Today we are comparing the BMW F 900 XR with the Ducati Multistrada V2 S. Stay tuned. Hello, hi there, greetings to you from wonderful Spain. Unfortunately, our conditions were a bit tricky. So this year's winter escape did not quite pay off 100%, but still we were able to really put these two motorcycles through their paces. And now we are going to tell you a bit about it. And what we are going to tell you, well, we are making an effort to pass on only the kind of information that you would not be able to read straight out of the marketing brochure. So as much as possible, real riding impressions. Let us dive straight in. We are starting with the Ergonomics. The Multistrada, for me, I would say, has a classic adventure touring riding position, meaning a relaxed upper body, relaxed knee angle, but still you have the possibility to shift your weight reasonably well to the front so that it also feels, I would say, like you are in control.
The XR is designed a little differently. It feels closer to a naked bike. You have a slightly sharper knee angle. You also sit a bit closer to the handlebars, which means you can lean towards the front even more if you want to. The upper body position, however, depending on your choice, can also be completely upright. What stands out is that you feel a bit cramped, especially here in the lower area. As tall riders, the two of us are around 1.85 meters tall. With our height and above, it can get a bit tight. On the other hand, of course, for shorter riders, the XR is the better choice because it is lower, and also, since you sit closer to the handlebars, maneuvers like moving the bike around are easier to manage, although it must be said that the XR offers a noticeably smaller maximum steering angle compared to the Ducati.
When we are rolling through town, let us first take a look at the engine. A lot has happened with the Multistrada. The engine has become much smoother at the bottom end. Basically, you can open the throttle quite cleanly from around 2000 revs and start accelerating. I would say the comfort zone starts from around 3000. Technically, you can also use fifth gear in town, but you definitely feel more comfortable staying in fourth.
With the XR, it is actually quite close. Just a touch earlier in the rev range where clean acceleration becomes possible. I would say from around 1800 revolutions, you can already accelerate without too much chain snatch. It is a slight difference, but it allows you, for example, to use fifth gear at 50 kilometers per hour a little more smoothly.
When it comes to throttle response on the Multistrada, I really have no complaints. On the BMW, even in road mode, you sometimes notice a slight jolt when opening the throttle. It is not a big issue though. As for the quick shifter, if we treat it as a comfort feature, particularly around town, I hardly have any reason to criticize the Multistrada. The amount of force needed on the lever is low, and almost all gear changes are carried out really smoothly. The electronics step in nicely to make sure everything happens cleanly. The clutch is also easy to modulate. It engages quite late and it requires a bit more hand strength compared to other models.
With the BMW, the clutch is noticeably lighter to operate but still very easy to control, so that is all fine. When it comes to the gearbox and the shifting itself, we do not quite get the same consistent performance. The feel at the lever and the smoothness of the gear changes vary a bit depending on which speed or rev range you are in. Lower down in the rev range, the feel at the shift lever is a bit doughy. Sometimes you have to push through a soft resistance before the gear engages. And when riding more aggressively, the overall feel and the shifting become a bit notchy. You could even say slightly wooden. It is complaining at a high level, but there is definitely a difference you can feel.
And what neither quick shifter can do is shift up with the throttle closed. That does not work with either of them.
Since we are already talking about accelerating out of town speeds, The next thing that matters is the thrust and how the power is delivered. Whether there are, for example, any dips in the rev range that you have to work through or wait out. I think here we can almost certify that once you reach the already mentioned comfort zone of the engine in the rev band, there is enough thrust at low and medium revs that you really do not miss anything, with perhaps a slight pressure advantage for the BMW.
Controllability of the rear brake on the Multistrada feels a bit sharp to me. On the one hand, you get a very, very good feeling at the lever and there is no excessive free play. But personally, I have to make a bit of an effort to modulate it cleanly because it bites relatively quickly.
And with the BMW, it is actually the opposite. You have quite a lot of free play at the rear brake pedal before you hit a rather soft, doughy pressure point. I think it is not ideal for fine control because you have to press quite a bit before anything happens, and especially when leaning more heavily to the right, you get into trouble as the tip of your boot points very far towards the road surface, which then limits the lean angle a little bit more.
Personally, I actually prefer the controllability of this brake, I have to say. So that is where rider types differ as well. I think I am a bit heavy-footed, so I prefer having more free travel and needing to do a bit more to get braking action. The conditions were not really, well, how shall I put it?
Crap.
We did not exactly have, how should I say, precarious conditions, but regarding heat buildup, we did not notice anything on either bike.
Now we come to the topic of suspension, and here the Multi V2 deserves particular praise, the V2 S, because we have semi-active suspension components on board, which firstly react very smoothly, provide good feedback, and most importantly, once again show just how much range a semi-active suspension can offer. It is impressively firm and sporty in sport mode, and yet comfortable in touring mode. You get everything you could wish for.
Even when it is in the sportily stable mode, thanks to the fine responsiveness, it never feels uncomfortable. With the XR, it is like this. Surprisingly, the motorcycles have the same suspension travel. You would hardly believe it because it feels so different. The suspension on the XR, I would say, offers a compromise that matches its price range. That means you do have a certain amount of comfortable damping, but never on the level of the Multistrada. Yes, there is a semi-active rear shock, which requires an extra charge, but you can only switch between road and dynamic modes. And when it comes purely to comfort, you actually do not notice any difference. And to me, the XR already feels more on the firmer side. And when it comes to suspension comfort, there really is a world of difference between these two bikes.
Briefly on seat comfort. Why briefly? Because to be honest, we simply did not cover enough distance to properly test the seat padding in full. From the few kilometers we did ride, it feels like the seat on the Multistrada offers slightly higher quality padding and a bit more comfort in the saddle, but as I said, take that statement with caution.
Wind protection with the Multistrada, I am very satisfied. If you move the screen to the highest position, it completely takes your head out of the wind, even at our height. There are absolutely no turbulences, and even around the shoulders, it has been slightly improved compared to older models. You feel less on the shoulders now, although at the very outer edges you still notice a little bit. With the XR, it is like this. You probably know they claim to have improved it as well.
Yes, the front end has been revised.
Obviously though, I think they must have only tested it with smaller people, because if you move the windscreen into the higher position, you get quite strong turbulences around the helmet. It gets restless and of course also noisy. Around the shoulders it is, I would say, a bit draftier too, but nothing too dramatic. However, as I said, when it comes to wind protection, we have a clear winner.
One more quick point, namely vibrations, especially at higher speeds. The Multistrada has none. You just get the good vibrations, nicely centered when the V2 gives it gas, but nothing high frequency. With the F900 XR, it is like this. From about 125, 130 kilometers per hour, you start to feel slight high frequency vibrations through the handlebars. For my taste, for my fingertip feeling though, it is still absolutely within an acceptable range. I agree.
If we take a quick look at the 1000 PS marketplace, we can see that for the Ducati Multistrada V2 S, as of April 2025, the price is 18,835 euros. And the F900 XR with comparable equipment currently costs 14,690 euros. And since I am already at it, I will continue with the service intervals. The Multi requires fresh oil every 15,000 kilometers, and the valve clearance has to be checked after 30,000 kilometers. For the XR, it is 10,000 and 20,000 kilometers. There are also differences when it comes to fuel consumption. With the BMW, we needed around 5 liters per 100 kilometers, whereas with the Ducati, it was an average of 5.6 liters. Now we can, is it our favorite category, sporty riding? Yes, yes. Okay, now we can talk about our favorite category, sporty riding, because even though in Nainzu, in its eyes tells us, well, it may not seem like it, do not worry, we actually had the conditions for it. Incredible but true. I will start with the Multistrada, as so often. We already mentioned it, from 3000 revs you have proper thrust. And what is really nice is that the Multistrada revs a bit higher, and above all it really delivers all the way to the top. That means you can almost rev the gears right out and you get something out of it because the power keeps building up to the very end. So even when you go into that crazy mode, it still feels more satisfying because you are not revving high for nothing.
With the BMW, when the Ducati already has serious thrust, you get serious thrust too, not much more, but you do have more thrust in the lower and middle rev ranges, and only once you reach the last third of the rev band, then the XR starts to run out of puff a bit, and you really need to shift earlier to keep using the thrust in the middle range. You can actually see this quite well in the roll-on acceleration measurement we did, where we accelerated from 50 to 100 kilometers per hour in the same gear. It showed not only which bike had more thrust in the mid-rev range, but also that with the XR you reached the end of the rev band much faster and had to shift sooner.
When it comes to riding behavior too, when it comes to handling, the Multi really stands out. Steering into corners takes no effort at all, and it remains completely neutral when leaned over. And that means you do not have to make any corrections through the handlebars or by shifting your body while in a lean. At the same time, if you have chosen your line poorly, the Multistrada makes it very easy and precise to correct. Also, as I mentioned earlier, the seating position gives you good contact with the front end. You feel confident, and you have those superbly sensitive suspension components, meaning you really get the feeling of knowing exactly what the front is doing. And if you start riding a bit more aggressively, making quicker direction changes, or if the road surface is less than perfect, the Multistrada handles it very well, thanks mainly to its forgiving and smooth chassis behavior. So if you downshift mid-corner, for instance, the suspension smooths everything out very nicely. So you could say it is elastic and not nervous.
With the XR, it behaves similarly, but still somewhat differently. It is basically an agile motorcycle as well, willingly leaning into corners. I also think it is well supported by the new adjustable front fork on the 2025 XR. But what is different? I would say it is a touch more stubborn when it comes to course corrections, as you mentioned, or when you are throwing it aggressively through the corners. It becomes a bit more unsettled. You notice a bit more movement on the XR. Also, it sometimes needs a bit more correction while riding, but I think that strongly depends on the riding style being used. When you lean the XR into a corner, the front wheel tends to steer in a bit too. That is not a problem. I find it still harmonious if you are using a pulling body style or a neutral style. Where it does not work so well is if you are using a pushing riding style. Then we notice that when leaning the bike, you constantly have to push or pull inside or outside to keep the motorcycle stable and clean in the lean. So my recommended riding style, or the one that felt most comfortable, was definitely a more neutral or pulling style. The tire is very agile, so maybe the F900XR would benefit from fitting a slightly less agile and more stable tire.
What we both noticed, I think, is that riding fast works quite well. It is definitely possible. Neither of the two bikes is slow, and fitting with that, the keyword stability on the Multistrada, neither of us managed to unsettle it. No matter how aggressively we rode or how bad the roads were, the suspension handled it all and kept everything under control. On the XR, you do notice the difference between road and dynamic modes. As mentioned, it does not bring more comfort, but it definitely brings a bit more stability when you really push it. However, it must also be said that if the road gets rougher or the maneuvers more aggressive, the rear end does have a slight tendency to start bouncing a bit. It is not dramatic, but you can feel that the components here cannot quite keep up.
Next point, throttle response. On the Ducati, I think it is very well done. Never overly sharp when you first open the throttle, but in sport mode, it does continue much more strongly than, for example, in urban or touring mode. The same generally applies to the BMW, but the initial throttle response is noticeably sharper. If you grab the throttle a bit carelessly, there is a small initial jerk, almost like a digital load change. And in dynamic mode, this effect is even more pronounced. So much so that I found it a bit unpleasant. That is why my favorite setting for the XR ended up being riding in Dynamic Pro mode, which is sharp in all parameters except throttle response, where I set it to road in order to get that extra smoothness.
And I do not know the system as well as you. Pro, you have to pay extra for that, right?
Of course, Pro always comes at an extra cost.
I love that. Those extra cost software features, the motorcycle is already equipped, but no, you have to flip a switch only if you hand over a bit more cash. Brilliant. And then we are also talking about braking, the braking chapter. On the Multistrada, again, nothing to criticize. We have a very, very strong brake that, while it really does bite, remains wonderfully controllable with superb progression at the lever. As for the XR, I would actually say that in terms of braking power itself, it is comparable. You can brake very sharply and hard as well. The controllability, however, is not quite on the same level as the Multistrada, but you can still fine-tune your braking quite well. All in all, perfectly acceptable. We have mentioned it several times already, but to emphasize it again, the feedback you get from the front is good on both bikes. However, I must add that when cornering, I actually feel a tiny bit more comfortable on the XR, simply because I am positioned a bit more over the handlebars.
I am an old adventure bike thrasher, so this slight disconnection of the front wheel through the ergonomics does not bother me much. I actually find that the suspension components and the braking on the Ducati are so good, and together with the already mentioned differences in handling, especially for me as someone who tends to push the bike down, it just feels a bit more complete on the Ducati. But it really is a matter of personal taste, it seems.
Lean angle clearance, I am completely satisfied on the Multistrada.
On the BMW, it is maybe a bit more limited by the feeler pegs, but without them, it would probably be quite comparable.
Quick shifters, I have to complain at a very high level again with the Ducati. In terms of speed and the force needed at the lever, it is excellent, just like it is in town when riding quickly. I would personally like it if the engagement when shifting could be just a tiny bit more noticeable. I would like to feel it a little more clearly. At the same time, you do have to mention that at high revs it sometimes has small hiccups. That means when you shift, the gear is not immediately engaged. There's a brief pause and it slots in, and it did not just happen once.
Yes, exactly. And funnily enough, with the BMW, it is the other way around. There, the feeling of the gear engaging actually gets better the faster you are and the higher the revs. The shifting itself also becomes more snappy. You could say it feels a bit wooden, but generally it is good. We were just discussing whether we should guess which one is actually quicker. Now and then the BMW also has these slightly imperfect shifts that take a bit longer, a little clunk. So in those moments it is a bit slower than the Ducati. But again, as you said, we are talking about a very high level.
A very high level. I think, or I hope we have said everything we could about the riding experience during these days. So let us move on to another interesting point, namely the topic of build quality. You have to keep in mind that there is almost a €4,000 price difference between these two bikes, at least if you take the BMW with the equipment we had. Considering the price of the Ducati, which sits somewhere around 18,000 and something in Germany, I think you are allowed to look a bit more critically. And when you take a closer look at the Ducati, actually you do not even need to look closely, you can clearly see with the naked eye that they have saved quite boldly in certain areas. It is pure Ducati philosophy to use those urine cup reservoirs for the curing kokusu, for the brake fluid. I do not know if there is a good reason for it. Maybe maybe weight savings. I do not want to now accuse them of anything shady, like trying to give the aftermarket business a bit of a boost. Let us assume innocence. But when you continue over to the left side of the bike, sometimes Ducati tries to hide the left side, like with the V4, with the V2, they just gave
Cable
up.
spaghetti deluxe.
A real cable spaghetti. There are open connectors, open cable ends in all colors. It reminds me a bit of a box of Lego when it comes to the colors. And it does not stop there, because then we also have the fit and finish of the fairing parts. Very, very adventurous.
Especially around the cockpit, unfortunately, yes.
Especially around the cockpit, because it is something you constantly see when you are sitting on the bike. And then I think to myself, I have just dropped 18.5 grand on this ultimate motorcycle, and all the time I am staring at this weird gap up front. I just find it cheeky, quite simply.
BMW here provides a very praiseworthy contrast. Although it is clearly much cheaper, if you just let your eyes wander over the bike for a quick comparison, you can see it immediately. Here, the brake fluid reservoir, no ugly urine cup look, and even things like the engine side. Sure, if you look closely, you also see cables running along there, but at least they have a small plastic cover or a sheath bundling them together nicely. Overall, you simply do not find any roughly finished areas on the BMW. There are none.
Yes, take an example from that. Two big companies, you could definitely pick up a few lessons from the other one. Power connections, or if you want to throw your phone on the handlebar for navigation, like we constantly have to do with our quad lock mount, because we are not exactly locals in Spain, you get a USB socket at the front on both bikes, which is up to date. On the Ducati, is hidden away in a little compartment. A bit unusual, but no problem, it works.
BMW, on the other hand, offers what I find a slightly more elegant solution with their factory accessory, the so-called navigator system.
Given the circumstances, we can also briefly touch on the topic of reliability, which normally is not fair to judge after just 2 or 3 days with the bikes, because usually there are no issues. But in this case,
there were indeed differences. We rode the Multistrada V2 a bit further up into the Pyrenees, and with repeated engine starts, we noticed that the typical Ducati whine you hear at startup became longer and longer, especially when it got colder. It is what some people call the classic Ducati start. It kept getting worse. Meanwhile, on the BMW, there were absolutely no starting issues, even if you look beyond such basic problems with simple things like how the switches work. And bear in mind, this was a brand new bike when we picked it up.
Thanks for mentioning it. I really wanted to rub that in again. It was a brand new motorcycle.
It had, what, 30 kilometers on it? Something like that. Brand new. And still, just a few days later, when the bike had around 400 kilometers, the buttons, the newly designed switchgear on the Multistrada V2 started to fail, getting stuck, not working properly anymore. And again, coming back to the price, that really should not be happening in this class. The BMW, meanwhile, with its familiar setup, had nothing new, but it just worked.
Apparently in the year 2025, you have to gain character through quirks like these. The emotional experience in the saddle, and I am mainly talking about the sound here, I think both motorcycles are actually quite similar in that regard, meaning for me there is no particularly emotional experience anymore when it comes to sound. Funnily enough, the XR engine actually sounds a bit more exciting at low revs, more bassy. Exactly, it has a bit more to offer in the bass range. With the Multistrada, it used to be the case that at higher revs you would get a really lovely airbox sound. That is no longer the case in this form. So even though it is a V2, I notice very little of that, neither in a positive nor in a negative sense, unfortunately.
I think you are being particularly critical there. I would say they both have a nice engine sound, but
from the outside they are really great.
I also think it is fine in the saddle, but it is no longer served to you on a silver platter the way it used to be, where you could really savor it. Instead, you hear it in the background, it fits, but it has just been throttled down and made compliant with Euro 5 plus regulations.
Yes, and that is exactly the point I like to hammer home. As I said, it is important to mention, from the outside it has a lovely sound. You do not need to feel embarrassed riding past someone. It is a nice 5.2 sound, but in the saddle itself I notice very little to nothing of it, and to me the sound in the saddle is exactly where you could still get a bit more out of Euro 5 plus. There are modern motorcycles under Euro 5 plus that give you, for example, a much nicer intake sound. And that is simply not the case here compared to what is possible on other bikes. Right? We can come to a conclusion, or no, forget the conclusion. I will just ask you a question, Gregor. We said around 4,000 euros price difference. Well, where do you feel that price difference?
I think in terms of riding dynamics, the Multistrada was simply the better bike for me. Whether it is the engine, and I think that is the one point where you could really argue the most, because that is a matter of taste. I like that engine. But especially when it comes to the suspension, huge difference for me. The Ducati's brakes are better as well, at least to my taste. Its handling, the way it lets you push it through corners, the way everything flows together, gives it a more complete package dynamically. It is clearly the better bike there. Is it 4,000 euros better? On public roads, both already offer about the maximum you can and should push, and then you still have to factor in the Ducati's build quality and reliability issues. If those 2 points were solid, it would be a tough decision, and I could say, if I also had a bit of emotional connection to Ducati, yes, I could understand why you would pay 18,000 for it, but with these shortcomings in pretty significant areas, it becomes really difficult.
Yes, that actually sums up the problem quite well, I would say. To add my own opinion here, basically, I agree that in terms of riding behavior, the difference is noticeable. I would also simply put it like this, to break it down to components. I can say it clearly. The suspension on the Ducati is vastly superior. And that is where I really do feel the price difference. It really is almost like night and day. I do not want to talk the XR down, but it is simply something completely different. Sure, it is a fully semi-active setup and all that. But still, I want to give viewers a bit of a guide. Is there actually a reason to pay that much more for this motorcycle, unless you say, I am a Ducati fan, or I love the look so much that nothing else matters?
Or money is no object.
Or money is no object. That feeling is foreign to me. It's why. So for me, the answer to that question is, well, as unhelpful as it sounds, a yes and no. Because it is no longer this overwhelming emotional experience I used to feel with older Ducatis. However, I do have to say, in this adventure touring, or actually more crossover segment, for me, there simply is no motorcycle that offers comparable handling, in the sense that it moves so harmoniously, is so neutral, and has such a beautiful suspension setup. That is why I can, with a relatively clear conscience, say that if someone is looking for absolute top quality in terms of suspension and handling, they will find it hard to get around the Multistrada. But if you are not the ultimate princess on the P, then that 4,000 euro price difference is absolutely not justified. Absolutely not. If the question is which bike offers the better value for money, then there is no doubt it is the XR, but it still does not change the fact that I would still go home with the Ducati.
Better motorcycle for the money, better motorcycle if you are willing to pay for it.
Exactly.
That is basically the conclusion.
That is the conclusion. Very well summed up, Gregor. It has been an honor. Even under these rather unworthy conditions. We still made a lot of videos despite the bad weather, and if you subscribe to the channel, you probably will not miss them. And if you like this, let's say, more precise attempt at presenting the riding behavior, then please give us a thumbs up. And now we can finally say goodbye. I would love to say we are heading home to somewhere warm, but no, we are continuing to work here in beautiful sunny Spain.
And we are going to enjoy it. Thanks for watching. See you next time.
Take care.